The first time I saw Cassandra Valentine, she was accusing the devil of breach of contract. I arrived at her apartment on the 21st floor, not by choice, but by a frantic, whispered plea from an anonymous parishioner who sounded as if their world had imploded. Nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared me for what lay beyond the threshold of apartment 21B. The door itself hung half-torn from its hinges, a splintered testament to an unseen struggle. Beyond it, a scene ripped straight from the Book of Revelation, or perhaps a very expensive asylum. The air was thick with dust, the acrid tang of drywall, and the cloying sweetness of what I later learned was Chanel No. 5. Furniture, sleek and minimalist as I'd seen in glossy magazines, was overturned, some pieces smashed. A shattered glass coffee table sparkled malevolently across the polished marble floor, each shard a tiny, broken eye reflecting the chaos. Silk drapes, once cascading down floor-to-ceiling windows, hung in ragged strips as if clawed by an unseen beast. It was a ruin, yes, but a very particular ruin, one that spoke not of an earthquake, but of a deliberate, furious demolition. $1 million apartment reduced to a high-end junkyard, and I stood on the edge of it, my black cassock feeling suddenly absurdly out of place, a beacon of order in an antechamber of pure, unadulterated madness. And then there was her barefoot. That was the first detail that lodged itself in my mind, an incongruous point of vulnerability amidst the wreckage. Her designer gown, or what remained of it, was ripped, revealing glimpses of skin that the world had paid millions to see, now simply exposed, raw. Her hair, a cascade of platinum blonde, was disheveled, framing a face streaked with tears and dirt, yet blazing with an intensity I had never witnessed outside of a particularly fervent novena. She wasn't just crying, she was screaming. Her voice, usually a practiced murmur in tabloids and on screen, was raw, guttural, a primal shriek of defiance. "He can sue me for all I care," she shrieked, her voice echoing off the remaining unbroken glass, making my teeth ache. "Let him. Let the devil himself come down here with his subpoenas. God is my witness, God is my witness." Facing her, a man in a perfectly tailored Italian suit stood rigid, a sheaf of papers clutched in his hand like a weapon. Julian Croft. I recognized him instantly from the entertainment rags, a predator in human form, his face a mask of cold, controlled fury. His jaw was clenched, his eyes narrowed to slits, dissecting her. He held up the papers, pristine and unblemished, a stark contrast to the destruction around them. "You signed, Cassandra?" Croft's voice was low, laced with venom, a hiss rather than a roar. "3 contracts, multi-year, multi-million. You signed away your future, your image, your very name. And if you think a little fit of hysteria is going to change that, you're more deluded than I thought." He stepped forward, encroaching on her space, holding the papers closer. "I will own you, Cassandra. Not just your future. I will own the very memory of your name. I will bury you so deep no one will ever remember you existed." I stood there, a priest, utterly useless, my mind reeling, my training, my years in seminary, the quiet solace of the confessional. None of it had prepared me for this. This wasn't a spiritual crisis in the traditional sense. This was a supernova of sin, wrath, and something else entirely, something utterly impossible. Because in her eyes, even as she trembled, even as she stood amidst the physical and legal ruins of her entire life, I saw it. Amidst the terror, amidst the very visible signs of a soul in profound agony, there was a spark, a flicker, a defiant flame that looked alarmingly, impossibly like faith, like holy terror. A conviction so absolute it transcended the madness of the moment. A porn actress, known for selling every last shred of her dignity, stood in the wreckage of her luxurious prison, screaming about the devil and invoking God as her witness, promising to break unbreakable contracts. And I, a priest, felt a shudder run through me, a premonition of something utterly beyond human explanation. The world saw a volatile, cornered sinner, a broken woman self-destructing under pressure, a catastrophic career implosion. Her producer saw a liability, an asset in rebellion, a contract to be enforced. But I saw something else entirely. I saw a battlefield, a soul upon whom God was about to work a great and terrible wonder, a collision of heaven and hell played out in a shattered Hollywood apartment. The impossibility of it burned in my mind. How could such a woman possess such defiant, holy conviction? What could possibly explain this sudden, radical, utterly illogical transformation? I didn't know then, standing there in the choking dust, the screams still echoing, the producer's threat still hanging heavy in the air. I couldn't comprehend it, but I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that this was not merely a woman breaking free. This was something far, far greater. This was a soul being fought over, claimed, and the evidence of that cosmic struggle, of the profound, miraculous contradiction, would soon manifest in a way that defied every earthly law, every human expectation. It would leave blank pages where words had once been iron, and a heart remade where only ashes remained, and I would be there to witness it all. That day, standing in the ruins of an empire built on illusion and despair, I had seen a flicker of something divine, a nascent courage that spoke of a battle already being waged within. But the seeds of that defiance, the first tremors of a soul yearning for liberation, had been sown weeks before, not amidst the glittering debris of Hollywood, but in the hushed, unassuming sanctuary of my own parish, St. Jude's. It was there, long before the screams and the shredded contracts, that the woman the world knew as Cassandra Valentine first walked through our doors, not as a defiant warrior, but as a terrified, trembling lamb. St. Jude's has always been a refuge, a haven tucked away from the relentless glare of Los Angeles. We are not grand, not architecturally significant in the way some of the older missions are, nor do we boast a celebrity congregation that fills the pews with perfectly coiffed heads. No, St. Jude's is for the weary, the forgotten, the ones who feel they've exhausted all other avenues. Our stained glass windows, worn smooth by generations of sun, cast muted, forgiving light upon the dusty pews. The air always smells faintly of old wood, beeswax, and the lingering scent of incense from Sunday Mass, a quiet, comforting balm for troubled spirits. It is a place where one can disappear, where the world's clamor fades to a distant murmur, allowing the whisper of God to finally be heard. She came on a Tuesday afternoon, a day when the church is usually quiet, save for a few souls seeking solace or a moment of prayer. I was in my office, buried under a pile of diocesan paperwork, when a soft knock disturbed the stillness. When I opened the door, she stood there, silhouetted against the filtered light from the hallway, looking utterly out of place yet desperately seeking to belong. She wore a simple dress, not the provocative attire she was famous for, and her face, scrubbed clean of the heavy makeup that usually defined her public image, looked vulnerable, almost childlike. Her eyes, however, held an ancient weariness, a profound sadness that spoke volumes even before she uttered a word. "Father," she began, her voice barely a whisper, a stark contrast to the defiant shouts I would later witness. I was told this was a place for people who need help, for those who feel lost." I smiled, a gentle, reassuring smile that I hoped conveyed the true spirit of St. Jude, patron saint of hopeless cases. "You've come to the right place, my child. We are all lost at times, and we are all in need of help. How can I assist you?" She wrung her hands, a gesture so innocent, so far removed from the bold confidence of her public persona. I would like to make a confession, Father, if it's not too much trouble." "Never trouble, my dear," I assured her, gesturing towards the church. "Come, the confessional is open." As we walked, I noticed the way she moved, with a hesitant grace, as if unused to moving without an audience, yet equally uncomfortable with the solitude. She wasn't Cassandra Valentine, the icon of sensual fantasy. She was Elena. That was the name she gave me, a name as unassuming and real as the tremor in her voice. Elena, a terrified young woman from Ohio, bearing a burden that seemed to press down on her with the weight of the world. The confessional at St. Jude's is simple, a dark wooden box at the back of the church. It offers the sanctity of anonymity, a small enclosed space where one can strip away the layers of pretense and stand naked before God. I settled into my side, the familiar scent of old wood and the faint echo of countless whispered sins comforting in its familiarity. I pulled the screen across, creating the necessary barrier, and waited. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft rustle of her movements as she knelt. I could feel her presence, a palpable wave of anxiety and a deep aching need. Then, from the other side of the screen, her voice came, initially halting, then gaining a fragile momentum, like a stream carving its way through rock. "Bless me, Father, for I have sinned. It has been a very long time since my last confession." Her voice cracked on the last words, betraying a torrent of unaddressed grief and guilt. I offered the usual opening prayer, then invited her to share, and she did. She unburdened a life story that was both tragically common and uniquely painful, a narrative that painted a vivid picture of a soul slowly, meticulously being corroded. She spoke of Ohio, a place that now felt like a distant, innocent dream, a broken home, not shattered violently but splintered by neglect, by the slow erosion of love and attention. Her father, a ghost in his own house. Her mother, overwhelmed, emotionally absent. Eleanor longing for belonging, for validation, for a love that felt as real as the ache in her chest. She spoke of feeling invisible, unworthy, desperate to escape a life where she felt she didn't matter. "I thought Los Angeles would be different, Father," she confessed, her voice thick with regret. "I thought it was where dreams came true. I was so young, so naive. I just wanted to be seen, to be someone." The city, she explained, had seemed to offer that initial glimmer of hope. The promises were dazzling, the opportunities intoxicating, but the reality, as it so often does in that gilded cage, was far harsher. She spoke of the gradual descent, the subtle compromises that built upon one another, each one seemingly small at first, each one chipping away at the girl from Ohio. A modeling gig here, a small acting part there. Then the increasing pressure, the demands for more exposure, more vulnerability, until she found herself on a path she hadn't consciously chosen, yet felt powerless to leave. "They told me it was empowerment," she said, her voice laced with bitterness. "They said I was strong, that I was controlling my image, but it felt hollow, like I was giving pieces of myself away, one by one, until there was nothing left." The slow, methodical corrosion of her soul. That was the phrase that resonated in my heart as she spoke. She described the industry not as a place of glamour, but as a factory, mechanizing despair, monetizing human vulnerability. She spoke of the constant performance, not just on camera, but in life, maintaining the persona of Cassandra Valentine, a woman of unshakable confidence and desire, while inside, Elena was crumbling. The lavish apartments, the designer clothes, the endless parties, they were not symbols of freedom, but walls of a gilded cage, trapping her in a role she despised. "I felt like I was trading my baptismal dignity," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, "for a prison of silk sheets and studio lights. I knew what I was doing was wrong, Father. Every day I knew. But how do you stop when everyone you know, everything you have depends on it? How do you say no when you've already said yes 1,000 times? Her confession wasn't merely a list of sins, it was a profound lament, a raw cry from the depths of a soul suffocating under the weight of its choices. She spoke of the hollowness that settled deep within her, a cavernous emptiness that no amount of success, no amount of money, no amount of fleeting adoration could ever fill. The self-loathing was palpable, a festering wound that had grown steadily over the years. She didn't just regret her actions, she regretted the person she had become, the person she felt she was forced to be. "I hated her, Father," she confessed, her voice barely audible. "I hated Cassandra. I hated looking in the mirror and seeing her instead of me. I hated that I couldn't remember who Eleanor was anymore. I tried to pray sometimes, but the words felt dirty. Like God wouldn't listen to someone like me. Like I was too far gone." My heart ached for her. This was not the confession of someone seeking a quick absolution, a spiritual reset button. This was a soul in profound crisis, grappling with the very possibility of redemption. She wasn't asking for a simple forgiveness. She was asking if it was even possible for someone like her, after all she had done, all she had endured, to be clean again, to truly be clean. "Father," she finally said, her voice now firm, though still trembling, "can a soul like mine ever be truly clean again? Can He really forgive someone who has done what I've done, who has lived the life I've lived? I don't just want forgiveness for the sins. I want to know if the stain can truly be washed away, if I can be whole again." The question hung in the air, a testament to her profound despair, but also, paradoxically, to a nascent, desperate hope. It was a question that pierced through the carefully constructed barriers of theological discourse and went straight to the heart of what we believe as Catholics, the limitless mercy of God. I knew, with every fiber of my being, that God's grace was infinite, capable of cleansing even the deepest stains. But her question wasn't about God's capacity, it was about her own, about her worthiness, about whether the person she had become could ever truly be undone. I took a slow, deep breath, formulating my response, knowing that mere words of absolution would not be enough. She needed more. She needed to know that the Lord, like the father in the parable of the prodigal son, was not waiting with a ledger, but with open arms, longing for her return. She needed to know that even though her life had been a dark and winding road, she had stumbled, perhaps unknowingly, into the very place where healing begins. Her desperation was a mirror reflecting the world's brokenness, the human capacity for self-destruction, but also the enduring, unwavering call of grace. It was a call that resonated deep within her, a whisper from the depths of her forgotten baptism, drawing her back to the source of all purity. I knew then that what she needed was not just an answer from me, but an encounter with the divine, a moment of such undeniable grace that it would shatter the chains of her past and rewrite the very narrative of her soul. And that, I would soon discover, was precisely what God was preparing to give her. And so, in the quiet sanctuary of the confessional, I waited. I had listened to the raw, unraveling tapestry of her life, the threads of trauma and ambition, of choices made in desperation, and the slow, insidious erosion of her spirit. Her plea, though unarticulated in precise theological terms, was clear. Can I be clean? Is there anything left of me that God could love? My heart ached for her, for all the souls caught in the labyrinth of worldly deceptions, clinging to glittering dust, while true treasure lay unclaimed. I had told her of God's boundless mercy, of a Father who sought not to condemn but to embrace, a Son who was not waiting with a ledger, but with open arms, longing for her return. She needed to know that even though her life had been a dark and winding road, she had stumbled, perhaps unknowingly, into the very place where healing begins. Her desperation was a mirror reflecting the world's brokenness, the human capacity for self-destruction, but also the enduring, unwavering call of grace. It was a call that resonated deep within her, a whisper from the depths of her forgotten baptism, drawing her back to the source of all purity. I knew then that what she needed was not just an answer from me, but an encounter with the divine, a moment of such undeniable grace that it would shatter the chains of her past and rewrite the very narrative of her soul. And that, I would soon discover, was precisely what God was preparing to give her. A few days later, she returned to St. Jude's. The afternoon sun, filtered through the stained glass of the chapel, cast kaleidoscope patterns of jewel tones across the worn stone floor. I was preparing for evening vespers when the sacristan, a quiet, observant man named Arthur, murmured that Eleanor was waiting in the confessional again. There was a subtle urgency in his voice, an unspoken recognition that this visit was different. As I took my place in the dimness behind the screen, the air felt charged. The familiar scent of old wood and beeswax was present, but something else had entered the space. A fragile, almost breathless anticipation. I heard her shift on the other side, a rustle of fabric, and then a long, tremulous sigh. It was not the sigh of defeat I had heard before, but one laden with awe, with a nascent, trembling hope. "Father Michael." Her voice was softer now, less brittle, yet infused with an intensity that held me rapt. Something happened. I leaned closer, my heart stirring with a quiet certainty. "Tell me, my child," I encouraged gently, my voice a low balm in the darkness. "God speaks in many ways." She paused, gathering her thoughts, and I could feel the sheer weight of what she was about to share. I had a dream. Not just any dream, Father. This was real. More real than anything I've lived these past 10 years. She began to recount it, her words stumbling at first, then flowing with an accelerating current of remembrance. She spoke of being on set, a familiar scene she had replayed countless times in her waking life and in the nightmares that haunted her sleep. The piercing, artificial glow of the studio lights, harsh and unforgiving, turning flesh into an object, emotion into a performance. The pervasive chill in the cavernous space, a physical coldness that seeped into her bones, mirroring the spiritual frost that had settled deep within her soul. The murmuring voices of the crew, their faces obscured by shadows and indifference, their gazes clinical, transactional. The scent of stale makeup, cheap perfume, and something else, a metallic tang of desperation that always hung heavy in the air. She remembered the scratch of the rough fabric against her exposed skin, the way her body felt alien and separate, merely a vessel for the lens. Every detail was sharp, etched into her memory with the vividness of a wound freshly opened. And then Elena described the shift. It wasn't a sudden, violent rupture, she explained, but a gentle, almost imperceptible softening around the edges of her perception. The harsh studio lights began to blur, their searing white fading into a soft, diffused luminescence, like light through a thick fog. The clatter of equipment, the hushed commands, the distant rumble of the city outside, all these sounds dissolved, receding into an expanding ocean of silence. The cold that had gripped her body did not vanish, but transformed, losing its brutal edge, becoming something softer, more ethereal, almost like the cool breath of dawn. The faces of the crew, once so defined by their roles and their detachment, shimmered and melted, their forms losing solidity until they were mere phantoms, wisps of mist that drifted away, leaving her utterly alone in a space that was no longer a studio, but something infinitely vast and yet profoundly intimate. "And then," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible, "she was there." My breath caught. I knew. even before she spoke the name. It was the answer to the quiet yearning I had sensed in her, the divine intervention I had prayed for. "The Blessed Mother," she continued, her voice trembling now with an emotion that was part awe, part sorrow, part utter disbelieving relief. She just appeared. Not in a blinding flash, Father, or with trumpets and choirs, just there, standing before me. The mist seemed to part for her, yet she wasn't separate from it. She was the mist, woven into its very fabric. She wore something simple, a cloak of deep midnight blue that seemed to absorb all the artificiality of the world around us. And there was light, Father, but it came from within her, a gentle radiance that softened everything it touched, without casting a single shadow. I closed my eyes for a moment, picturing it, feeling the truth of her words resonate deep within me. This was no ordinary dream. This was a visitation, a grace. "Her face," Elena went on, her voice imbued with a reverence that was completely new to her. "Oh, Father, her face. It wasn't stern, not angry, not judging. I expected judgment. I deserved judgment. But her eyes, they were full of such sorrow, a profound maternal sorrow. It wasn't for her, not for herself, but for me, as if she carried all the sadness of every wrong choice I had ever made, every wound I had inflicted on myself, every tear I had cried in secret. Her gaze was like a river of love, flowing over me, washing away all the layers of cynicism and self-loathing I'd built up. It was pure, unadulterated compassion. She paused again, and I heard the faint sound of a choked sob, quickly suppressed. "She didn't speak at first," Elena recounted, her voice regaining a fragile strength. "She just looked at me, and then she wept. Real tears, Father. Tears that glistened like liquid stars as they traced paths down her cheeks. They weren't bitter tears, but tears of infinite love, of longing. And as each tear fell, I felt something within me crack open, something I hadn't even known was locked away. It was as if her tears were washing away the grime from my own soul, revealing a flicker of light I thought had been extinguished forever. The silence that followed was holy, pregnant with meaning. I could almost hear the droplets of Mary's sorrow falling, cleansing. "And then she spoke," Elena breathed, the words carrying the weight of eternity. Her voice was not a sound I heard with my ears, Father, but with my very soul. It was like music, soft and clear as a spring bell, yet it resonated in every fiber of my being. And she said only this, one simple sentence, one truth that shattered everything I thought I knew about myself, about God, about my life. She paused, and then, her voice breaking slightly, she repeated the words that had burned themselves into her memory. "My child, my son made you for glory, not for this." The words hung in the quiet darkness of the confessional, electric and profound. "My child, my son made you for glory, not for this." So simple, yet so utterly devastating in its truth. I felt a shiver run down my spine, not of cold, but of divine recognition. This was the voice of a mother, seeing her beloved daughter trapped, calling her back to her inherent dignity, to the purpose for which she was created. "That's all she said," Elena whispered. "Just those words." But as she spoke them, the mist, the light, her form, it all began to recede, to dissolve back into the silence. I reached out, Father, instinctively, desperately, wanting to hold on to her, to those words, to that feeling of pure, unconditional love. But she was gone. Only the echo of her voice remained, resonating in my soul as I awoke. She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath. I woke up in my bed, Father, in that expensive apartment I hated, surrounded by all the things I thought I wanted. But the first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the external quiet, but an internal one. The frantic, screaming voices in my head, the ones telling me I was worthless, that I deserved this life, that I was trapped, they were gone. Replaced by those words, "My child, my son made you for glory, not for this." They weren't a condemnation, Father, but an invitation, a gentle, loving invitation back home. I listened, my heart swelling with a mixture of awe and profound gratitude. This was it. This was the encounter, the undeniable grace that I had known she needed. God, in his infinite mercy, had sent his blessed mother to whisper truth into the wounded heart of his lost daughter. "For years," Elena continued, her voice stronger now, imbued with a newfound clarity, "I had justified everything, the money, the freedom, the fleeting attention, the escape from my past. I told myself I was strong, independent, that I was taking control of my life. But in that dream, seeing myself through her eyes, through Mary's sorrowful, loving eyes, I saw the lie. I wasn't free. I was enslaved. I wasn't strong. I was broken. And the glory I chased was a cheap imitation, a gilded cage. My entire life, Father, I had been seeking worth in the world's mirror, only to be shown my true reflection in the tears of a heavenly mother. Her words painted a vivid picture of the internal battlefield. The truth of Mary's words had not merely resonated, they had seared away years of carefully constructed rationalizations, burning through the layers of self-deception that had protected her from the brutal reality of her choices. It was a painful cauterization, but a necessary one, preparing the ground for genuine healing. "And now, Father," she said, her voice filled with a quiet, fierce resolve, "I know what I have to do. I don't know how to do it yet, but I know I cannot live for this any longer. My Son made you for glory, not for this." She repeated the words again, as if tasting their truth, letting them soak into her very bones. "It's as if, for the first time, I understand what glory truly means. It's not about fame or wealth, it's about who I was made to be, who God made me to be." I sat in the quiet of the confessional, my own eyes welling up with tears of joy. This was the miracle, not yet the external physical manifestation that would shake the foundations of earthly power, but the profound internal miracle of conversion. A soul awakened, a heart transformed. Mary, our Blessed Mother, ever the gentle handmaid of the Lord, had come to reclaim her child, to remind her of the Father's love and the Son's ultimate sacrifice for her redemption. She had offered not condemnation, but an unwavering maternal gaze that saw past the sin to the sanctity that still resided within. "Elena, my child," I said, my voice thick with emotion, "what you experienced was a profound grace, a direct intervention of heaven. The Blessed Mother, in her boundless love, acted as the instrument of God's mercy, calling you by name, reminding you of your infinite worth in His eyes. Glory, my dear, in God's language, is not about worldly recognition or fleeting applause. It is about becoming fully who God intended you to be, a beloved daughter, imbued with His divine image, destined for eternal communion with Him. It is to live in freedom, in truth, reflecting His love back into the world." I paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle. This dream, this visitation is not merely a sign, it is a summons, a call to shed the chains of your past, to abandon the false idols of this world, and to step into the glorious freedom for which you were created. It will not be easy, my dear. The path to true freedom often passes through the crucible of difficulty, but you are not alone. You have a heavenly mother who weeps for you, a father who longs for you, and a son who has already paid the price for your liberation. I could hear her quiet weeping now, not of despair, but of a cleansing, purifying sorrow, mixed with an immense, dawning hope. For the first time, she saw her life not through the distorted lens of human judgment or the hollow promises of her industry, but through the eyes of a heavenly mother who saw a beloved daughter who was lost and who had now, by grace, been found. The chains that had bound her might still be visible to the world, but in her heart, something profound had shifted. The truth of her identity, whispered by Mary herself, had become her new North Star. And I knew with every fiber of my priestly being that this was just the beginning of God's marvelous work in her life. The world might have seen a volatile, cornered sinner, but heaven had just claimed its prize. The quiet weeping I heard from Elena that day in the confessional was not the soft lament of a soul clinging to its despair, but the profound, resonant sorrow of one being washed clean. It was a cry mixed, too, with an immense dawning hope, a fragile seed just beginning to sprout in the hardened soil of her heart. For the first time in years, she saw her life not through the distorted lens of human judgment, nor through the hollow, glittering promises of her industry, but through the eyes of a heavenly mother, a mother who saw not a commodity, but a beloved daughter who was lost, and who had now, by grace, been found. The chains that had bound her, those invisible fetters of contract and expectation, might still be visible to the world, but in her heart, something profound had irrevocably shifted. The truth of her identity, whispered by Mary herself, had become her new North Star, and I knew, with every fiber of my priestly being, that this was just the beginning of God's marvelous work in her life. The world might have seen a volatile, cornered sinner, but heaven had just claimed its prize. The shift in Eleanor after that vivid, sacred dream was palpable even to me, who only witnessed its immediate aftershocks. It was as if a dormant spring within her had suddenly burst forth, not with a gentle trickle, but with the force of a geyser. The fear that had always been a constant companion in her eyes, a residual tremor from a life lived on the edge of exposure and judgment, began to recede, replaced by a fierce, almost terrifying conviction. She no longer spoke of possibilities or contingencies, but of certainties. The words of Our Lady, "My child, My son made you for glory, not for this, had not merely touched her soul, they had redefined its very architecture. Father, she said to me during our next conversation, her voice still quiet but imbued with an unfamiliar resolve, I cannot go back. I will not go back. It feels like a betrayal of something sacred, of myself, of her. Her gaze, once prone to darting away, now met mine with a steady, unwavering light. The dream wasn't just a dream, was it? It was a command. I nodded slowly, understanding. Such encounters, when truly divine, transcend the realm of mere suggestion. They are clarion calls, irrefutable and absolute. They demand not just belief, but action. A call, Elena, I gently corrected, one that asks for your yes. And a yes to God often means a no to the world. That no began, she recounted, with a single trembling phone call. It was to Julian Croft, her producer, the architect of her public persona, and, effectively, her primary enslaver. The phone felt impossibly heavy in her hand, a conduit to the life she was desperate to sever. Her apartment, once a sanctuary she had meticulously decorated to reflect the opulent image of Cassandra Valentine, now felt like a mausoleum. Every designer vase, every silk throw, every piece of abstract art screamed of the compromise she had made, of the soul she had bartered. The air itself seemed thick with the cloying scent of artificial success, a fragrance she now found repulsive. She sat on the edge of her pristine white sofa, the city lights twinkling indifferent and cold beyond her panoramic windows, her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird seeking escape. This was it, the precipice. On one side lay the known, albeit abhorrent, path, the contracts, the fame, the gilded cage. On the other, an abyss of uncertainty, but also, she now knew, the only true path to freedom. She took a deep, shuddering breath, invoked the name of Mary, and dialed. The voice that answered was smooth, unctuous, and laden with the practiced cheerfulness of a man who dealt in illusions. Cassandra, my dear, to what do I owe the pleasure? A new idea? A sudden creative spark? There was a predatory undertone, a possessive quality to his voice that made her skin crawl. Julian, she began, her voice a little too high, a little too strained. I'm calling to tell you I'm quitting. A beat of silence, sharp and sudden, like a snapped wire. Then a low, humorless chuckle. Quitting? Darling, that's not a word in your vocabulary. You're under contract, remember? Multi-year. Exclusive. You're Cassandra Valentine. You don't quit. You are... His tone had hardened, the practiced pleasantness dissolving into a steel edge. No, she insisted, finding a strength she hadn't known she possessed, fueled by the memory of Mary's tears. I'm not Cassandra. I'm Elena, and Elena is done. I'm terminating my contracts, effective immediately. Another silence, this one colder, more menacing. When Julian spoke again, his voice was flat, devoid of any pretense of warmth. Eleanor? Right. Look, Eleanor, let's be very clear. You don't terminate anything. We own your image. We own your name. We own your future. Every breath you take on screen, every dollar you earn, every headline you make, it's all ours. You signed, you agreed, you reaped the benefits. Now you fulfill your obligations. He launched into a litany of legal clauses, speaking of specific performance, breach of contract, liquidated damages. He painted a picture of financial ruin so complete, so inescapable, that it made her head spin. Do you understand, Elena? If you walk away, we will sue you for every penny you've ever earned, every penny you would have earned. We'll freeze your assets. We'll make sure you can't work in this industry or any other ever again. We'll make your name infamous, not as a star, but as a cautionary tale. Your reputation will be shredded, your life destroyed. You will never recover. Each word was a hammer blow, striking at the carefully constructed facade of her courage. Her hands trembled violently now, clutching the phone as if it were a lifeline, even as it delivered her potential death sentence. The world she had thought she was leaving behind was fighting back, dragging her deeper into its mire. The image of Mary's sorrowful face flickered in her mind, a beacon against the encroaching darkness. My child, my son made you for glory, not for this. The words, once a comfort, now felt like a heavy burden, a divine imperative that demanded an impossible sacrifice. I don't care, she whispered, the strength in her voice having withered under his verbal assault. It was a lie, of course. She cared deeply. The terror was real, a cold knot tightening in her stomach, but beneath the terror, a strange defiance, a spark of holy rage began to flicker. You can't own my soul, Julian. No contract can do that. He laughed, a harsh, dismissive sound. Your soul, Eleanor? Spare me the melodrama. We own your market value. And that, my dear, is all that matters in this town. You have 24 hours to reconsider. If I don't hear from you, expect legal action that will make you wish you'd never been born." And with that he hung up, leaving her in the ringing silence of her luxurious, now suffocating apartment. She sat there for what felt like an eternity, the receiver still pressed to her ear, listening to the dial tone's monotonous hum. The reality of his threats was undeniable. Her life, her financial stability, her very identity in the eyes of the world were inextricably woven into those contracts. To break them was not just career suicide, it was social, financial, and existential annihilation. The dream of Mary, the promise of glory, felt distant now, overshadowed by the stark, brutal reality of earthly chains. But then, as the initial shock began to recede, something else rose within her. It wasn't despair, not entirely. It was a raw, visceral anger, not at Julian Croft, not at the system, but at the part of herself that had allowed this to happen, that had traded her baptismal dignity for such an empty, soul-crushing existence. And intertwined with this righteous anger was a new, desperate conviction. If these contracts were the chains, then they had to be broken, no matter the cost. If God had called her out of this life, then he would have to provide the way, for she, Eleanor, was utterly powerless against such formidable earthly forces. Her eyes fell upon a stack of documents on her glass coffee table, her personal copies of the very contracts Julian Croft had just invoked. 3 thick binders, each meticulously detailing the terms of her servitude, each bearing her signature. Cassandra Valentine, in bold, flowing script. They were the tangible proof of her bondage, the legal instruments of her undoing. A tremor went through her, but it was not purely fear. It was the precursor to a storm. She reached for the first binder, her fingers clenching around its stiff cover. It felt heavy, oppressive. With a sudden explosive surge of strength, she tore the cover off. The sound was surprisingly loud in the silent apartment, a ripping noise that resonated with the tearing of her old life. She pulled out the first page, the official letterhead of Croft Studio emblazoned at the top, followed by columns of dense, unforgiving legal text, and there at the bottom her signature. She stared at it, her own handiwork, the mark of her consent to a life she now abhorred, and then, with a guttural cry that was half sob, half roar, she began to tear. She ripped the page once, twice, then into a dozen jagged pieces, the crisp paper yielding with a satisfying, almost cathartic sound. She didn't stop there. She shredded the next page, and the next, and the next. The air around her filled with fluttering white confetti, each piece a fragment of a chain broken, a lie exposed. Her hands moved with frantic, almost ritualistic energy, tearing, twisting, crumbling the pages until the floor around her was a snowdrift of paper shards. The sound of tearing, ripping, shredding became a furious rhythm, a primal chant of defiance. When the last page of the third contract lay scattered around her, a strange calm descended. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Her muscles ached, but the furious energy had not entirely dissipated. It simply shifted focus. Her gaze swept across the apartment, a testament to the very wealth and status that had entrapped her. The expensive Italian marble floors, the custom-made silk drapes, the avant-garde sculptures that cost more than most people earned in a year. Each object suddenly seemed to mock her, a glittering icon of her spiritual destitution. A lamp, sleek and minimalist, stood on a pedestal in the corner. It was a gift from Julian Croft after her last successful film. With a choked cry, she lunged at it, seizing its cold metal base, and brought it crashing to the floor. The shattering of glass, the metallic clang, echoed through the vast space. It was not mere vandalism, it was an act of exorcism. This was the temple of Cassandra Valentine, and she was tearing down its idols. She moved through the apartment like a hurricane. A vase of fresh-cut orchids, meticulously arranged by her housekeeper, was swept from its pedestal, scattering petals and water across the polished wood. Her walk-in closet, a veritable boutique of designer clothes and accessories, became a battleground. She pulled garments from their hangers, tearing silk, slashing leather, ripping seams. Her collection of expensive shoes, each pair a step taken further from her true self, were flung against walls, their delicate forms distorted and broken. A framed poster of her most famous film, featuring her image, bold and provocative, stared back at her. With a primal scream, she grabbed it, ripping the poster from its frame, shredding her own face, her own body, into 1,000 pieces. It was a grotesque, beautiful act of self-annihilation, not of her essence, but of the false self that the world had created and adored. Each ripped fabric, each shattered object, each torn image was a defiant refusal to be bound by the material trappings of her past. It was a violent, desperate reassertion of her true identity, whispered by Mary in the sacred dream. Hours later, she collapsed amidst the wreckage, exhausted, disheveled, but strangely, profoundly lighter. Her apartment, once a symbol of opulence and control, was now a scene of utter devastation. Broken glass glittered like malevolent stars. Fabric lay in shredded heaps. Furniture was overturned, lamps broken, pictures torn. It was chaos, absolute and undeniable. And yet, in the heart of that chaos, she found a strange, nascent peace. She had shredded the contracts, both literally and symbolically. She had torn down the idols of her past. She had stripped away the layers of the false self, leaving only Elena, bruised and battered but defiantly free. I often think of that scene, piecing it together from her tearful yet resolute recounting. I imagine her there, surrounded by the ruins of her worldly success, standing barefoot amidst the shattered remnants of her identity, screaming defiance against the powerful forces that still sought to claim her. Her producer, a man whose face would soon be a mask of cold fury, would hold up a sheaf of papers and promise to own not just her future, but the very memory of her name. And in that moment, seeing the holy terror and defiant faith in her eyes as she stood amidst the wreckage of her former life, I knew then, as I had known when I first laid eyes on her, that I was looking at a soul upon whom God was about to work a great and terrible wonder. The world saw a volatile, cornered sinner. I saw a battlefield where heaven was preparing its offensive, an offensive that would begin in the most unlikely of places, the sterile, wood-paneled chambers of a Los Angeles courthouse. The sterile, wood-paneled chambers of a Los Angeles courthouse, as I would soon discover, possessed a peculiar kind of quiet terror. But before Elena could stand in that hallowed yet chilling space, the forces against her had to complete their earthly work. Julian Croft, the producer, was not a man to issue idle threats. He was a predator, ruthless and efficient, and his legal team moved with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of an executioner. Barely had the dust settled from Elena's holy rampage through her apartment, a cathartic act of self-emancipation that ironically only deepened her earthly entanglement, than the first volley arrived. A summons. A thick, official envelope, heavy with the weight of law and cold authority, delivered by a man whose face was as impassive as stone. It was not a request, nor a negotiation, but a declaration of war. Croft's company was suing her for breach of contract, for defamation of their brand, for the perceived damages to their future revenue stream, and for the psychological torment of their esteemed producer. The sum demanded was staggering, an almost comical number designed not merely to recoup losses, but to utterly obliterate tens of millions. It was a sum that could not be paid, only suffered. My heart ached as I watched her receive the papers. She had brought them to me, her hands trembling as she smoothed the crisp, legalistic jargon across my desk in the rectory. Her eyes, usually so fiercely alive with a nascent faith, were wide with a primal fear. It was the fear of a small creature caught in an impossible snare, a rabbit in the jaws of a titan. There was no escape. The legal labyrinth was designed to crush, and crush it did. Within days, her meager personal savings, what little she had managed to squirrel away from years of what she now saw as blood money, were frozen. Her credit cards, the last vestiges of financial independence, were cancelled. The luxurious apartment, the very one she had so defiantly torn asunder, was reclaimed by the studio's holding company. Every piece of furniture, every designer gown, every trinket a symbol of the chains she now found herself in. She was left with nothing but the clothes on her back, a small duffel bag of essentials, and the one possession she had truly held on to through all the turmoil, the simple silver crucifix I had given her after her first confession, a gift from the parish. It was modest, worn smooth by the touch of countless hands, but to her it was now priceless. It was all that remained of her life that was truly hers, untouched by the world's grasping demands. She was homeless, financially ruined, legally ensnared, and spiritually exhausted. The initial surge of defiant faith, the righteous anger that had empowered her to shred her contracts and dismantle her gilded cage, had given way to an overwhelming sense of helplessness. It was a raw, visceral despair that threatened to consume the tender shoots of belief that had just begun to sprout in her heart. And so she came back to St. Jude's, not to the hushed intimacy of the confessional this time, where words could articulate her burden. This struggle was beyond words, beyond absolution in the traditional sense. It was a crisis of existence, a test of trust so profound that it demanded a different kind of sanctuary. She sought not a priest, but the presence of God himself, in the stark, silent language of suffering. She went to our Gethsemane garden, Nestled behind the old rectory, away from the bustling street, our Gethsemane garden is a small, hallowed space, shaded by ancient olive trees whose gnarled branches seem to bear the weight of centuries. It is not an opulent garden, nor meticulously manicured, but rather a place of quiet contemplation, intentionally left a little wild, a little untamed, to mirror the human heart's own wilderness. At its center stands a life-sized statue, carved from rough stone depicting Christ in the agony in the garden. He kneels, head bowed, hands clasped, the very picture of profound sorrow and surrender, a silent, eternal witness to the struggle between human will and divine purpose. A few weather-beaten benches invite weary souls to rest, but most pilgrims to this sacred spot prefer to kneel on the cool, damp earth, just as our Lord once did. The air there always smells faintly of damp soil, rosemary, and the elusive scent of impending rain, even on the sunniest days, a scent I've often thought of sorrow mingled with hope. It was there, before that stoic statue, that Eleanor took up her vigil. I saw her there early that first morning, curled on the cold stone bench, clutching the small silver cross to her chest, her face pale and drawn. I approached cautiously, not wishing to intrude upon her profound grief, but to offer the humble comfort of presence. "Elena," I murmured, my voice soft as the morning light filtering through the olive leaves. She looked up, her eyes unfocused, brimming with unshed tears. "Father Michael," she whispered, her voice rough as if she hadn't used it in days. I don't know what to do." "You are here," I replied simply. "That is a good start." I brought her a thermos of warm tea and a small buttered roll, placing them gently beside her. "Eat, my child. Your body needs sustenance even when your soul feels starved." She nodded weakly, but made no move to touch the food. Instead, she slowly, deliberately slid off the bench and knelt on the rough, damp earth, just as the Christ figure before her. She didn't pray aloud, not then. She simply knelt, her gaze fixed on the statue, as if drawing strength from his suffering, finding kinship in his silent agony. For 3 days, Elena barely ate or slept. She would sometimes drift into a fitful slumber on one of the benches, but most of her waking hours were spent on her knees, before the statue of the agony. I would bring her water, small pieces of fruit, a blanket when the evening chill descended, leaving them quietly within reach. I never pressed her to speak, knowing that some struggles must be wrestled with in solitude, in the deep silence of the soul. My role was simply to be a silent sentinel, a shepherd watching over a lost lamb, praying for her in my own heart as I went about my duties. From a distance, I watched her. Her posture spoke volumes, initially tense, shoulders hunched, jaw clenched, as if still bracing for an unseen blow. She was still fighting, I knew, still trying to grasp for a solution within her own power. I could almost feel the vibrations of her internal struggle, the desperate mental gymnastics of a trapped mind seeking an exit, any exit. But slowly, subtly, a change began to manifest. The frantic energy began to subside, replaced by a quiet, persistent rhythm. Her fingers, which had initially gripped the cross so tightly her knuckles were white, began to move with a more relaxed, deliberate motion. She had begun to pray the rosary. Hour after hour, day after day, the beads would slip through her fingers, a silent litany, a repetitive cadence that gradually, inexorably began to unravel the knot of fear and desperation in her heart. Each decade, each Hail Mary, was a surrender of another fragment of her shattered will. I saw her face, initially etched with raw despair, soften around the edges. Her brow, once furrowed in worry, smoothed. Her breathing became deeper, more regular. It was the physical manifestation of a profound spiritual unburdening. She was no longer asking God to win her lawsuit, to provide a clever legal loophole, or to miraculously conjure millions of dollars from thin air. She was past that. She was no longer trying to manage the outcome. Instead, she was placing her entire life, her freedom, her very future into his hands. She was letting go. On the third evening, as the last rays of the setting sun painted the ancient olive trees in hues of violet and gold, I sat on a bench a little further away observing her, my own heart filled with a quiet reverence. She had been kneeling for hours, her head bowed, her body swaying almost imperceptibly with the rhythm of her prayer. The small cross was clutched in her hand, but it was no longer a talisman of desperate hope. It was a connection, a bridge to the divine. Then, from her lips, barely audible, a whisper escaped into the tranquil evening air. It was ragged, raw with exhaustion and emotion, yet imbued with an unmistakable clarity. It was a prayer not of demanding, but of yielding, not of fighting, but of profound trust. "You asked me to follow," I heard her murmur, her voice a thin thread against the encroaching twilight. "You asked me to leave it all behind. I have. I have nothing left. I cannot break these chains myself. My God, my Father, lead me out. Please, just lead me out." And in that moment, as the final syllable of her surrender dissolved into the gathering dusk, I knew that the greatest miracle had already begun. The external chains of debt, lawsuit, and legal entrapment were still very real, still binding. But the internal chains, the chains of self-reliance, of control, of the desperate human need to orchestrate one's own salvation, those had been shattered. She had, in the truest sense, entered her own Gethsemane, wrestled with her own demons, and emerged with the pure, unwavering trust of a child in its loving parent. It was a surrender not of defeat, but of ultimate victory, for it was at the precise moment that she completely let go that God's hand would finally be free to act. The stage was set, not for a legal battle, but for a divine intervention of truly breathtaking proportions, one that would make the most hardened cynic pause and question the very fabric of reality. The morning of the preliminary hearing dawned not with the bright promise of a new day, but with a shroud of anxious anticipation that clung to the city like the morning fog. For Elena, I knew, it was not the culmination of a desperate battle, but the ultimate test of her surrender. As she stood silently beside me in the quiet corridors of the courthouse, the chaos of the world seemed to recede from her. Her face, though pale from her ordeal in the garden, held an uncanny serenity, a peace that transcended the sterile, imposing environment. Her eyes, which had once held such a haunted, frantic light, were now clear, reflecting a deep, unshakable trust. It was as if the very air around her was blessed, impervious to the worldly storm that was about to break. We were ushered into Judge Thompson's chambers, a room that felt less like a place of impartial justice and more like a mausoleum for lost hopes. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and the hushed formality of legal proceedings. Dark, polished mahogany paneled the walls, reflecting the subdued light from a single tall window that offered a glimpse of a grey, indifferent sky. A heavy antique clock on the mantelpiece ticked with an almost oppressive rhythm, marking the slow, inexorable march towards what Julian Croft and his formidable legal team undoubtedly believed would be their triumph. Croft himself sat opposite us, a man whose tailored suit seemed to be an extension of his own unyielding will. His gaze, when it occasionally flickered towards Elena, was devoid of any human empathy, filled only with the cold calculation of one who sees a valuable asset attempting to escape its bounds. Beside him, his attorney, a sharp-suited man with an unnervingly confident smile, arranged his papers with an air of theatrical precision, occasionally glancing at Elena with a look of condescending pity. It was a tableau of power versus vulnerability, of worldly might against what seemed to the uninitiated eye like utter defenselessness. I sat slightly behind Elena, my heart a silent litany of prayers. My hand instinctively sought the rosary beads hidden in my pocket, its smooth, cool weight a familiar comfort. I watched Elena closely, observing the gentle rise and fall of her chest, the quiet clasping of her hands in her lap. She was not trembling. She was not outwardly afraid. Her Gethsemane had been fought and won, not on this polished legal battlefield, but in the sacred quiet of our parish garden. She was merely present, a vessel awaiting the divine will, whatever it might be. The judge, a man whose face was a roadmap of countless difficult decisions, motioned for the proceedings to begin. His voice, when he spoke, was a low rumble, devoid of any discernible emotion. "Mr. Davies," he addressed Croft's attorney, "you may present your evidence." Mr. Davies rose, a smirk playing on his lips, a subtle but unmistakable gesture of triumph. He walked to the center of the room, radiating an almost palpable smugness, and with a flourish that was clearly rehearsed, presented a heavy, leather-bound portfolio. "Your Honor," he announced, his voice ringing with a conviction he clearly believed unassailable, "we have here the master copies of the contracts signed by Ms. Elena Rodriguez, known professionally as Cassandra Valentine. These documents were retrieved this very morning from a secure, climate-controlled vault at the Bank of America, witnessed by 2 independent bank officials. They are the original, undeniable instruments of agreement." He laid the portfolio on the judge's vast, dark mahogany table, and with deliberate, almost painful slowness, unlatched its gold clasps. From within, he carefully extracted 3 documents, each encased in its own protective sleeve. They looked formidable, imposing, brimming with the very authority of the law. He held the first one aloft for a moment, letting its presence fill the room, a silent declaration of victory. Then, with a confident, almost ceremonial gesture, he placed it squarely in front of Judge Thompson. A heavy silence descended upon the room, broken only by the persistent tick of the clock. Judge Thompson, ever the professional, reached for the document, his gaze meticulous and unhurried. He took it from its sleeve, his fingers brushing over the heavy, cream-colored paper. He adjusted his spectacles, his eyes scanning the top of the page, then moving downwards, my breath caught in my throat. I watched his face, searching for any flicker of expression. At first, there was only the practiced neutrality of a man accustomed to examining countless legal texts. He tilted the paper slightly, catching the light. He ran a thumb over the embossed studio letterhead, pristine and perfectly raised. He turned it over, then turned it back. His brow furrowed, a faint line appearing between his eyes. He leaned closer, almost imperceptibly. Croft's attorney, still standing, seemed to sense a slight deviation from the expected. His confident smile faltered for a fraction of a second, quickly masked by an intensified look of mild confusion. He cleared his throat. "As you can see, Your Honor," he began, attempting to guide the judge's gaze, "the authenticity is beyond question. The notary's seal is clearly—" But Judge Thompson held up a hand, a silent signal for him to stop. The judge did not look at the attorney. His gaze remained fixed on the document, a strange, growing perplexity clouding his features. He brought the paper closer, then held it at arm's length. He squinted. Then he simply stared. Elena remained utterly still beside me, her gaze directed at the judge, her expression unreadable. I found myself leaning forward, my heart pounding a rhythm against my ribs that was as loud as the ticking clock. What was it? A smudge? A misprint? The judge then slowly, deliberately laid the paper flat on the table. He took off his spectacles and polished them with a handkerchief, his eyes never truly leaving the page. When he put them back on, he picked up the document again, holding it up for everyone in the room to see, and then I saw it. My breath hitched, my mind reeled, trying to reconcile what my eyes were witnessing with the logical dictates of reality. The paper was indeed authentic. The studio letterhead at the top, Crimson Dawn Studios, was perfectly printed, its stylized logo shimmering faintly under the chamber lights. The notary's seal, a robust embossed circle, was present and accounted for at the bottom right. This was, beyond any shadow of a doubt, a master contract. But every single word printed on the page, every clause, every stipulation, every number of the payment schedules, every line that detailed Elena's obligations and the studio's rights, was utterly and irrevocably gone. Where streams of complex legal jargon should have been, where the bold, precise typeface outlining years of her life and labor ought to have been meticulously laid out, there was nothing. The surface of the page was as smooth and unblemished as if it had just come from the stationers fresh out of the factory. It was pristine. It was blank. Elena's own signature, that bold, defiant scrawl she had described to me, the very mark of her worldly bondage, was simply not there. The space where it should have resided was empty, untouched, as if the ink had been drawn back into the depths of the paper itself, or had simply never been applied. A gasp, sharp and involuntary, escaped my lips. It was a sound I barely recognized as my own. My mind, trained in the rationalities of theology and the practicalities of parish life, struggled to process this impossibility. This was not merely an erased document, it was a document that had never contained ink, yet bore all the hallmarks of a fully prepared, official instrument. Silence, deeper and more profound than before, enveloped the room. It was no longer merely a formal quiet, but a stunned, disbelieving hush. The air thickened, charged with an energy that felt both sacred and terrifying. Julian Croft's attorney, Mr. Davies, his confident smile now completely vanished, stepped forward, a bewildered frown creasing his brow. "Your Honor?" he managed, his voice a strained whisper, clearly expecting a joke, a trick of the light, anything but this stark, undeniable reality. Judge Thompson slowly, deliberately turned the blank page towards Mr. Davies. His eyes, though still holding that initial bewilderment, now held something else, a dawning realization that transcended the boundaries of his esteemed legal experience. He looked at the attorney, then at Croft, then at Elena, and finally, his gaze lingered on me for a fleeting moment. In that glance I knew we shared a silent, unspoken communion. We were witnesses. We were standing on holy ground. The miracle was not shouted from the heavens. It was whispered on a blank page in a quiet paneled room before the very eyes of those who had sought to bind a soul. God had not merely broken the chains, he had revealed that they had never truly existed in his divine ledger. The stage, I now understood, had indeed been set, not for a legal battle, but for a divine intervention that shattered the very fabric of human expectation, proclaiming in glorious silence that the will of heaven cannot be constrained by the contracts of man. The first contract lay on the table, pristine and utterly blank where words should have been. The silence that followed was not merely the absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating thing pressing down on us all. Julian Croft, whose initial smirk had evaporated into a look of bewildered fury, leaned forward, his eyes darting from the page to his attorney, then to Elena, accusing, disbelieving. This is impossible," he finally stammered, his voice tight with a rage that bordered on panic. "It's a trick, a forgery. She's tampered with it, Your Honor." His attorney, a man usually composed, was pale, his carefully constructed confidence crumbling like dust. He snatched up the paper, turning it over, holding it to the light, as if a secret code might reveal itself. But there was nothing. Only the faint watermark of the studio, the embossed seal, and the ghostly outline of where text once surely resided. The judge, however, remained outwardly impassive, though the slight furrow in his brow deepened, a testament to the seismic shift occurring beneath his stoic facade. He held up a hand, silencing Croft's agitated accusations. His voice, when it came, was low and measured, cutting through the rising tension. "Mr. Croft, your assertion of tampering implies physical alteration. I see no evidence of chemical treatment, no erasure marks, no digital manipulation discernible to the naked eye. This document appears, for all intents and purposes, to be a freshly printed, unblemished page from its original stock, save for the letterhead and seal." He then turned his gaze to Croft's attorney. "I stated there were 3 master copies retrieved this morning from your bank vault. Produce the others." A bead of sweat trickled down the attorney's temple. With a trembling hand, he reached into his briefcase, extracting the second envelope, sealed and stamped with the bank's official mark. The air in the room grew palpably thick with anticipation, tinged with a creeping dread for some and a burgeoning, breathless hope for others. My gaze flickered to Elena. She stood utterly still, her hands clasped tightly before her, her eyes wide, not with fear but with a dawning, fragile comprehension. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was one of utter, bewildered awe. The attorney laid the second contract on the table with a reverence born of fear. The judge leaned forward. Everyone else held their breath. And there it was again. The pristine studio letterhead, the flawless heavy paper, the deeply impressed notary's seal, and a complete unsettling emptiness where the intricate legal clauses and Elena's bold signature should have been. Every single word, every line of text had vanished. It was as if the ink had simply evaporated. A low gasp escaped someone in the room. This time, even Croft fell silent, his face a mask of profound disbelief. He looked like a man who had seen a ghost, or perhaps in his case a demon making a mockery of his meticulously crafted legal empire. "The third," the judge said, his voice now a mere whisper, yet resonating with an authority that left no room for dissent. The third envelope was opened, its contents revealed with a terrible, beautiful inevitability, another blank page. 3 identical documents, meant to legally shackle a soul, now stood as stark, silent testaments to an intervention beyond human comprehension. There was no rational explanation, no loophole, no legal precedent for such a thing. It was an impossibility made manifest, a profound silence that roared louder than any courtroom pronouncement. The judge leaned back in his chair, his hands resting on the polished wood of the table. He closed his eyes for a long moment, as if to reset his senses, to search for a logical explanation that simply wasn't there. When he opened them, his gaze swept across the room, lingering on Elena, then on Croft, whose bluster had entirely collapsed into a horrified stupor. Finally he looked at me, a flicker of something ancient and unnameable in his eyes. "There is no contract to enforce," he stated, his voice now clear and firm, the weight of his decision falling like a gavel strike. "Without a verifiable agreement, there is no case. This matter is dismissed." The words hung in the air, a benediction. I watched Elena as the verdict sank in. Her quiet tears became a torrent, her shoulders shaking, not from sorrow, but from the immense, crushing weight of liberation. She sank to her knees, oblivious to the judge, to Croft's sputtered protests, to the stunned silence that had fallen once more upon the room. She simply knelt, her face buried in her hands, her whole being given over to a profound, wordless thanksgiving. God had not torn up the contracts. He had supernaturally erased the debt, fulfilling the psalmist's promise. "As far as the east is from the west, so far has he removed our transgressions from us." It was not a clever legal maneuver, but an act of divine annulment, a heavenly ledger cleansed of its earthly demands. The chains Elena had believed so binding, so inescapable, had never truly held her in the eyes of the Almighty. They were but illusions, banished by a silent, wondrous act of grace. Today, years later, the echo of that moment still resonates in the quiet corners of my memory. Elena, rising from her knees that day, was not the same woman who had entered that judge's chambers. The desperation had been washed from her face, replaced by a serenity so profound it felt almost tangible. There were no shouts of triumph, no dramatic declarations, only a gentle, radiant peace that spoke volumes. She walked out of that room a free woman, not merely from legal entanglement, but from the spiritual bondage that had held her captive for so long. The legal world might have recorded it as a dismissal due to inexplicable circumstances, but we who had witnessed it knew it for what it was, a divine decree. Eleanor did not become a public figure, a celebrity convert, or a nun whose story graced the pages of glossy magazines. Her miracle, like so many of God's most intimate graces, was for her, not for the world's spectacle. Instead, she chose a path of profound, quiet service. You can find her most weekdays at the Women's Shelter, sponsored by our diocese, a humble haven nestled not far from St. Jude's. There she works tirelessly, counseling young runaways, girls lost and adrift in a city that promises so much and delivers so little. She looks into their frightened, defiant eyes and sees the desperation she once knew, the same gnawing hunger for belonging and purpose that led her down her own painful road. Her joy, I tell you, is not loud or boisterous. It is as deep and as real as the ocean itself. It is the steady, unwavering light of a soul reconciled with its Creator, a vessel truly filled with grace. Sometimes people, hearing whispers of her past, will ask me if I truly believe a miracle occurred in that judge's chamber. I tell them that I saw the evidence of it not on the blank pages of those contracts, but in the luminous peace that now illuminates Elena's face, in the genuine laughter that now spills from her lips, in the unwavering kindness she extends to every broken soul she encounters. For the greatest miracle, dear friends, was not merely the vanishing ink that freed her from earthly chains. No, the truly astounding wonder was the restoration of a soul, a precious daughter brought home from the far country. It serves as a living testament that no contract on earth, no matter how ironclad, no matter how binding its clauses, can ever supersede the covenant of mercy offered by God. He is a God who desires not our bondage, but our glorious holy freedom, a freedom purchased at a far greater price than any legal fee, sealed not with ink, but with the blood of his Son, and affirmed by the loving intercession of his Blessed Mother. And in Elena we see that freedom radiant and real.